Hello, I'm Karen Tulo, Equality Chief Correspondent and host of Black in Focus at Bloomberg, and welcome to Corporate Mandate for Change, a Bloomberg Equality briefing. It's been a year since the killing of George Floyd. His death and those of others in the midst of the deadly COVID-19 pandemic sparked global protests and cries for change. CEOs and corporate boards responded with pledges, commitments, initiatives, hoping to shift their workplaces and steer society at large. Thrust into the spotlight, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion officers stepping in to help deliver on promises for a more equitable workplace. We will hear from leaders on how their roles have evolved over the past year and how they're balancing the priorities of employees, shareholders, and customers. But before we get started, a few announcements. First, I would like to acknowledge our sponsor, Cisco, for supporting today's event. Now, if you experience any issues with audio or video quality, try to refresh your browser or use the chat box on the bottom right corner of your screen for support. You will be able to submit questions during our interviews. We hope you will engage with us. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. To submit a question, please click open the white tab on the right-hand side of the video window. If you note your name and geographical location, we'll even give you a shout out. And please engage with us on social media using the hashtag #BloombergEquality and engage with other attendees in the event chat in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And now let's get started with our first session. Please join me in welcoming Delana Brand. She's a Vice President, People Experience, and the Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter. James Moman, he's the Senior Vice President and Chief Equity Officer at 3M. And Lori Yanez, Head of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion at Mass Mutual. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Good to see you all. Well, we have quite a group here, and we only have a short amount of time. So I want to lead off first with employees and the whole notion of employee engagement. James, you joined 3M last December after nearly 20 years of D&I work at General Mills, I believe. 3M announced a $50 million five-year social justice fund. What role are employees playing in how those funds are distributed, and why?
Yeah, Karen, thanks for the question, and I'm happy to be here. We've really felt it was critically important as the organization redoubles its efforts in the equity space to really make sure we brought our employees along on that journey. Obviously, we made a significant investment, $50 million over 5 years, as you referenced, but we really wanted to make sure the voices of our employees, particularly our employee resource networks, were engaged as we decided how to deploy those funds and what community organizations would benefit from those resources. So we took essentially the last year to work with our ERNs, investigate local nonprofit partners to collaborate with, and the ERNs' voices, their assessment were really critical to some of the choices we made on $1 million worth of that $50 million investment. And so we announced 2 weeks ago some of the benefactors of that initial $1 million investment from our employee resource networks. And again, it gives them an opportunity to commit to supporting those organizations in our communities. They feel some responsibility. Their voices were critically important in how we assessed and decided to deploy those resources. So again, that collaboration between employees and the organization are just going to be critical moving forward as well.
And how important was it, especially because the George Floyd case was a national story, but it was also a local story? How important was that employee engagement piece for your company in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously being a Twin Cities company, there is an added responsibility to be a positive voice for change as we address some of these issues in our Twin Cities community, but frankly more nationally as well. And so the $50 million that I mentioned earlier and the $1 million from our employee resource networks were devoted to Twin Cities organizations that are going to help us address some of the racial equity issues that we face. Obviously, the trauma and the tragedy of the last year has impacted 3Mers around the world, but in particular those who live in the Twin Cities. And so giving them outlets to be part of solutions versus trying to almost languishing in the trauma and the tragedy of the last year, we really wanted to have positive outlets. This is just one. There's obviously a ton of volunteer activity that goes on in the community as well that we provide 3Mers access to. But again, this was one significant way for our employee resource networks to elevate their voices and really be positive, part of the solution and positive benefactors of those solutions.
So, Delon, I want to go to you next, staying with the employees. At Twitter, employee involvement in DEI is seen as a company-building exercise, work that gets recognized at review time and at compensation for some of the employee leaders. Explain the logic behind that for us, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is something that is extremely important because if you fundamentally believe that diversity and inclusion is a business imperative and that it really is a key component to driving the success of a company, then you have to recognize the contribution and the impact of those individuals who are in the organization doing the hard work and showing up every day trying to make a difference. It's really not any different than any other part of the organization where you recognize performance. And so this is something that I'm proud of, have changed at Twitter. Clearly, everyone at Twitter is accountable for inclusion and diversity on a day-to-day basis, but the heart and core of our inclusion and diversity efforts are our business resource groups. They not only show up every day and perform their core job function, but they also commit to leading diverse community of tweeps around the world. They help drive our inclusion and belonging efforts and really help shape our next generation of leaders. And so we need to commit to show up for them like they show up for us. And so that led to two fundamental shifts or changes at Twitter. First, we introduced a new compensation program, as you said, that pays them not just for their core day-to-day job, but also pays them for the work that they do in inclusion and diversity every single day. No more side hustles at Twitter, as we say. And second, equally important, is that we needed to ensure that they were fully supported to really lean into this work without having to be concerned about it being viewed as distracting from their day-to-day job. And so what we did is completely reshape our performance management process to incorporate and recognize company building activities like inclusion and diversity work so that it is embedded in decisions like performance assessments and promotion decisions and talent planning. So the bottom line really is if you say the work is valued, then you really need to treat it as such.
So, Lori, I want to come to you and really continue this business imperative talk. Mass Mutual started its DEI journey back in 2007, I believe, just before you joined the company. And
yes.
From what I understand, they wanted to kind of move beyond just some of the programs they were doing to really seeing results, right? This building and baking in this business imperative. And we're already getting some questions from the audience. They want to know, how do you drive that business imperative internally? Delon already gave us a little hint, I think, to use the word accountability. Can you talk a little bit about that business imperative?
Well, I would say that I'm very lucky because, as you said, I joined in 2008. In 2007, there was already a sense of that. I always say our diversity journey started in the business with our sales and marketing organization. There was a sense that there was an opportunity from a business perspective. So it started with our CEO and our board and our executive team. So when I came on board, I had partners at the table, which was really great. So I didn't have to sell the business case to them, but we definitely needed to make sure that we got the rest of the organization on board. And I would say we'd been on our journey for a long time. And about 2015, we decided that we wanted to really focus on education to help people understand. I felt like you need to have the right mindsets in order to drive the right behaviors. So we've doubled down on the education space, and we're talking about transformative learning so people understand their behavior and the way that they look at the world matters. So first we started there, and then we said, well, how do we drive accountability? And we landed with a way to hold everybody accountable by making it part of company performance. And that was in 2017. It's in our annual incentive plan, which is our bonus program. It's a percentage of the bonus program. And just like other things like revenue and sales, it's measured as, if we become a more diverse organization, that's good from a business perspective. So we've been doing that since 2017. And the other thing that we did was we thought it was important to be very transparent. So we started sharing, which is very different for an organization like ours, to just put our demographics out to all of our employees. But that's what we did in 2017 when we made D&I a part of company performance, because people needed to know what they were being held accountable for. So that's kind of been the magic formula that leads us to where we are today. And I would say that, maybe a little bit better prepared, I would say, for everything that happened last year. I think that we were at it a little bit longer, and we've had conversations that were difficult and challenging for a long time. But I didn't have to sell so much about the business case. There was already a belief in it, if that's making sense. We still have to. We still have to talk about why it's important from a business perspective. Yeah.
And James, I see you nodding. Is this resonating with you, this notion of really holding managers accountable and building it into the company structure? What do you do at your company?
Yeah, the part that resonates with me is that, look, I think it's critically important that senior executives support the work that we all do in diversity and inclusion. It's critically important that the top of the organization advocates, but I always say that our efforts fall apart in the middle of the organization. And so if we don't have ways to engage with middle managers, to give them the understanding for why this matters, why it should be relevant to their day-to-day interactions with employees, some of the decisions that they make on talent, but then also holding them accountable for the progress we all need to make. Again, we can't make progress as an organization if the entire organization isn't rowing in the same direction, and middle managers are just essentially important to the progress that we'll make in all of our respective organizations. So senior leadership is critically important, but how we cascade that accountability and that leadership throughout the organization, especially at middle management level, is critically important.
So, Delana, what are you doing at your company to get those middle managers, keep them aware, but also motivated to deliver?
Yeah, it's so critically important. You can't change, the sort of culture of the organization with leadership just at the top or programs that come out of corporate. It really is the day-to-day experiences that are shaped by managers and the everyday employees. And so we do a couple different things. First, we have embedded within the business inclusion and diversity business partners that work very, very closely with our HR business partners and managers to create programs and to offer support for managers to learn how to lead more inclusively, hire more inclusively, and just make sure they're equipped to support the very diverse workforce that we have. The other thing that I think is really important, back to the accountability, is that we are really, really holding managers accountable for driving inclusion and diversity in the organization. We've recently launched an inclusive manager badge, which essentially is a program of recognition for managers who get this right. So they've got to do a whole host of things, including a toolkit of trainings. They've got to make sure that they're creating the right sort of cultural environment as measured by the inclusion index that we have as a part of our engagement scores. And we're sort of tracking that, if you will. But through the efforts of them being accountable and that being very visible to folks around the organization, we're starting to see managers change their approach and really get involved and embracing this notion of really, really having a diverse workforce and being very inclusive and embracing sort of the diverse thoughts and experiences of everyone on their teams.
I want to move on to other stakeholders, but very quickly, Lori, I think you may play into this as well, and perhaps James. How does technology help? Are there any particular tools that you're using that you think is particularly helpful? James or Loren?
I will share that I wanted to just mention, we have a manager leader program or a leader program to build DEI capabilities throughout the organization. And it's the same thing. We're trying to give them the right level of education, give them the right tools, drive the same level of transparency and accountability through all the layers of management. And we have a commitment to get through all of our managers in 2022, but we've already involved about 700 of our middle managers through this program. So So we're measuring inclusion by measuring the level of cultural competence of our leaders. So there's a tool that we're using, and some people are very familiar with it. It's the Intercultural Development Inventory. That is an instrument, an assessment, if you will, to measure your cultural competence. And we've started using that back also in 2015. And so we've measured everybody's cultural competence. We told them that we don't care where you land, as long as you commit to getting better over time. And we've retested twice. And we've seen the level of cultural competence across the organization grow. And that's recently I just had a meeting with our board of directors and shared that. We went from a 20% at the highest levels of cultural competence, and now we're at 50% of our leaders are at the highest level of cultural competence. So we're using that tool. Most people use it as a self-assessment, as a developmental in nature, and it should be. But what we're doing, we're taking the collective and saying, where are we landing holistically as an organization? So that's one tool that I will share.
Hey, Karen, can I add one more quick?
Yes.
On the technology side, I do think it's critically important that companies invest in workforce analytics and data analytics. We talk about data analytics when it comes to driving the business. In this space as well, the ability to have powerful data to help drive differential decisions in the organization is just critically important. This area is not short of having access to data, but what you do with that data to drive insights and drive behavior change is critically important. So if I was going to encourage anyone to invest in any resources, it really is that workforce analytics and the ability to drive insights from our D&I data.
And this ties into the next question I was going to ask, and this is another question that's kind of popular with our audience as well. Do your customers, your investors, your shareholders, financial markets, do they appreciate how important this work is to you? Clearly, this is you're passionate about this work. Do they appreciate why this work is so important to you? By you meaning your companies. This is a business imperative. And how do you communicate that? As part of this communication, having the data, having the intelligence to be able to tell people this is what we're doing, why, and here are the results. Anyone, James, Delana, anyone?
Go ahead. Well, I'll just say
Delana.
This is something that we have to recognize, that no one company can sort of solve diversity, equity, inclusion by itself, right? We need the entire ecosystem of corporate America, even beyond that, if you will, to come together on these things. And all the priorities have to be aligned as such. And the good news is usually it is around things like profitability and growth, which is why it's so important to make sure that from an inclusion and diversity perspective, you have really connected your I&D journey, if you will, to the business, that it's a part of the business. And so as you're having those conversations with investors, with shareholders and other key stakeholders, that you are not talking about it sort of, off by itself, but it is integrated into sort of everything that you're doing. That's how we approach it at Twitter. So we have diversity and equity and inclusion goals. We share those with the board on a quarterly basis. We share those externally as a part of our publications or in our annual inclusion and diversity report. We have a corporate impact report that we share with investors and shareholders to demonstrate all the progress. And at the core is that analytics. It is truly the data and us tracking our progress sort of against those things. So it's incredibly powerful. I think that at the end of the day, go ahead.
We have an audience question. What kind of metrics are you actually using, and how do those metrics affect day to day? If someone has a really good granular example of a metric that you actually look at and how that might affect your day to day. That's something that you really measure.
A whole host of metrics, everything from the core basic sort of, representation metrics all the way through those experiences that we talked about around inclusion. Are managers creating an inclusive experience as measured by our inclusion index, if you will. So we're tracking everything end to end in the entire employment life cycle as it relates to those core decisions around inclusion and diversity and how that shows up.
And I would imagine perhaps James and Lori, issues around retention would be another metric that you would also track. I want to
Yes.
make sure we have time for this. We only have about 5 minutes left. Clearly, this has been a very trying time. We've had George Floyd's murder. We've had the coronavirus. We've had the Great Recession. These were not the first shocks to our system. These are not going to be the last, right? We have questions about how DI offices prepare for the future, right? Which is crystal balling. Zolani, you shared when we were chatting earlier about back in 2018, Twitter started to decentralize its workforce in a way to diversify. So that years later, when COVID-19 landed, you already had some experience with remote work, and we're not going to try to tackle remote work now. The point is that because of some things that were done before, you're already ahead of the curve. And that's something that you all have touched on a bit. Just thinking about DEI can set you up well for things that might come up that you just can't anticipate. The question, though, has been asked, where should DEI sit? Is it an HR function? Where should it sit? Zolana, does it matter where DEI sits? Should it sit in HR?
Yeah, I think this question comes up a lot, and I think a lot of folks are struggling with it. And I answer very clearly: it doesn't matter. There is no best organizational structure for DEI. What matters least is where the position sits, and what matters most is sort of the who, what, and where in terms of where the biggest impact at the end of the day is going to be had, and where the accountability actually is going to reside. And that's going to be different for every organization. We all know that in an ideal world, like, our roles should not even exist, right? There shouldn't be an office of DEI anywhere. It should just be how business is done, and it should be culturally embedded in the organization. At Twitter, what is most important for us is the integration of DEI in everything that we do end to end in all of our people, programs, and processes, which is why my role is accountable for more than just DE&I. I also have things like global compensation, so I can make sure we're driving pay equity. I have global benefits to make sure that we are really offering and designing inclusive benefits. And again, that's going to look different for every organization. So for me, it's all about building the structure around accountability and where it's going to happen most in the organization.
Lori, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree that it's less about where you're sitting, and I think it's more about the access that you have to the decision makers in the organization and how much influence you can have with them wherever you're sitting. So I've reported to the head of HR, and I've reported to, wasn't called a CEO. I worked in a laboratory, a scientific laboratory, but reporting into other leaders. And I think that it's the same. Just having the access and the ability to influence leaders, the ability to get in front of the board of directors, to have the conversations. I think those are the things that matter and help us to get to where we want to be. And it doesn't hurt to be in the human capital part of the organization, because the employee piece is such a big piece.
And James, you're newest in your role at your company, right? What have you learned over the past? I guess it's been around the past 6 months. What have you learned? Is there anything how you would structure any part of your team differently for those people who may be adding new teams or restructuring teams, or perhaps just beefing up their teams?
Yeah, the one piece I'll close with, that's unique to 3M, or relatively unique in the space, is I do think historically our D&I roles have been primarily focused on what happens in the four walls of the organization. One of the unique parts of my job is I also have responsibility for our external engagement. So our foundation, our philanthropic efforts, our community engagement efforts sit in my organization as well, because I think there is an intersection between the two. Again, as I talked about earlier, our employee resource groups do a lot of work internal to the organization to drive our culture of belonging and inclusion. There's a tremendous amount of impact they can have externally as well. We're starting to see the intersection of external and internal. And again, in my capacity, it gives me the resources, the funds, and the opportunities to engage and drive change when it comes to equity, both internally and externally. So that's just one nuance that I would call out.
All righty, guys. Well, thank you so very much. Delana, Vice President, People Experience and Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter. James, Senior Vice President, Chief Equity Officer at 3M. And Lori, Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Mass Mutual. And Lori, I'm going to leave with the last word will be something you said. Don't be afraid of failure. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a world where every one of us is connected. Everyone. Everywhere. Where everyone is included. Where everyone has access to information, education, opportunity. When everyone and everything is connected,
that's really beautiful.
Anything is possible.
Good morning.
Cisco, the bridge to possible.
Thank you and welcome to Shari Slate, the Chief Inclusion and Collaboration Officer at Cisco, Vice President of Inclusive Future and Strategy. Wow, what a title that is. Shari, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, Pamela, it's wonderful to be here.
So look, last summer was a time of social and racial reckoning in the US and around the world. Many companies were forced to grapple with how to respond internally to employees and externally to clients and consumers. Do you think this moment in time has fundamentally changed the role and potential impact of D&I practitioners in a much more holistic way than ever before?
So, Pamela, the answer is yes. Last summer was an absolute reckoning. And in that reckoning, it caused us to begin to think about things differently. Mm-hmm. When we stop and think about what it shined a light on, it shined a light on the gap of the size between our aspiration and our effort. What was fascinating and profound is that so many people didn't understand that there was a gap. And the reason why is because our efforts have been longstanding. I think many of us felt that there was a lot of progress made as D&I practitioners. You and I and everybody else doing this work knew that there was a gap. But for many, they were asking the question, how could this be? And the reality is, and sits with the answer to these three questions. First, were we curious enough about systems of oppression to understand them? Second, did we get moved to get proximate to the lived experience of people and communities that are experiencing it? And third, did that then move us to action so that we actually did something about it? Now, if your answer isn't a resounding yes, therein lies the gap. And the size of that gap sits with how many of us didn't say yes to all three of those questions. Right. Like where we are, Pamela, right now is we are at a moment of choice. Individuals and companies get to choose how they show up in this moment in new and different ways. From a Cisco perspective, we are 77,000 people strong. We choose to do our part to bend the arc of the universe towards fairness and justice and equity and inclusion. And I have to tell you, Pamela, my job has changed. Your job has changed. We are always on. We are rapid responders. Everything that we do is high stakes. We have to have an abundance mindset because we are solving for all, not just for a few. And last but not least, we're in service of something so much bigger than an individual. It's about generational change.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And as we think about this, many companies are now reevaluating their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, and they're redefining what corporate impact looks like. Shari, tell us a little bit about how Cisco has changed its strategy over the last year.
So last year was a moment. It wasn't just a moment for us. It was a moment for many companies like us that have been on this journey to solve for fairness and equity and inclusion for a really long time. what we're really clear about is that we have to take bold, intentional, and deliberate action. What we know is that what we have done in the past, that traditional approach of, giving money and then trusting that other entities will do right with it, is insufficient. It's insufficient to lead and to meet the moments today and tomorrow. The other thing that is very clear to us is that we can't do this alone. We actually have to find other partners who want to and have a mission to create a recurring impact, and a recurring impact that will last for generations.
You mentioned that companies have to do more than simply give money to good causes. Cisco recently was in the news for giving $150 million to support historically Black colleges and universities. How is that different from traditional corporate impact measures?
Oh, okay. So first, let me say, Pamela, companies always have to give money. Like, that is paramount. That is part of what we do. It is foundational. What I would say from a Cisco perspective is that we are transforming how we think about the next horizon of community impact, really focus on driving generational change for individuals and communities. Our purpose as a company is to power an inclusive future for all. That was the foundation for how we structured and created our social justice beliefs and our actions. One of those actions is that we are going to do our part to preserve the legacy of HBCUs for generations to come. Some may be asking why. For us, education is foundational for driving generational change. And HBCUs deliver to the world the lion's share of Black talent in America, and they are absolutely critical to creating an extraordinary pipeline of talent for the world. So we are excited. We are excited to do our part. We are not doing it alone. The $100 million that we are putting forward as it relates to hardware, software, and services, which will actually not just preserve HBCUs, but ensure that they have the infrastructure to make them relevant today and tomorrow. And we're not doing this work alone. We are doing it in partnership with two incredible partners, Student Freedom Initiative, which is helping us to identify those schools, and AVC Technologies. They are a triple gold partner of Cisco's, and they are doing the assessment and the installation. But here's what's really important. These partnerships, they're vital. They are vital to our ability to scale, our ability to drive sustainable change, but most importantly, they're an accelerant. They're an accelerant in our ability to actually drive recurring impact for generations.
Thank you. So talk to me a little bit more about Student Freedom Initiative and the endowment that will pay for 4,500 students education in perpetuity. Why did you specifically choose Student Freedom Initiative to partner with?
So when we heard about what Student Freedom Initiative was doing to remove the financial barriers for Black students to get an education, we were inspired. We were inspired to join them. Student Freedom Initiative is taking an innovative approach to applying solutions that work, things like endowments, in very new and different ways to solve very long-standing challenges. What we saw was an opportunity to create a recurring impact, one that would last for generations, but one that would actually, hopefully, inspire others to join us. You see, inspiration is the currency in this landscape, and we absolutely believe that when you inspire, it drives other people to action, and that action will actually create pathways to prosperity for individuals and communities around the world.
Absolutely. So let's talk about inspiration for a little bit longer. How do corporations inspire people to solve the world's problems? How do you convince people at Cisco and other companies that really care about making the future a better place?
It starts with leading by example. Our CEO, Chuck Robbins, last year at Davos said, a 21st century company must fundamentally care about all of its stakeholders, not just the majority. That statement is profound because what it means is that we have to think beyond just business impact. We actually, to do the kind of change we're looking to do, you have to put communities at the center, and then you have to look at what kind of impact they need and how you can contribute in doing your part as an individual or as a company. When you think about the $50 million seed investment that we did with Student Freedom Initiative, it is just the beginning. The reality of driving generational change doesn't sit with that initial seed investment. It actually sits with others coming to the table. Here's why. That endowment doesn't actually deliver an impact in perpetuity for students unless it reaches $450 million. What that means is that there is room at this table for other individuals or companies to join us in supporting the endowment that SFI started. The reality is it rests on all of us. There isn't any one of us that can do it alone. Inspiration is absolutely the new currency, and hopefully as others listen and watch, they will be inspired to take action. I would encourage all of you, if you're listening, go check out Cisco's actions. We have many, so the HBCU action is just one of 12. Hopefully they will inspire you to either create your own actions and or join us in creating a bigger impact together. This is how we move mountains. This is how we do it together. And I would say, let's go do this together.
Well, Shari, thank you so much for that very rousing call to action. You've heard it here today. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shartia Brantley, Deputy New York Bureau Chief and Bloomberg Live Senior Editor. I am delighted to discuss creating a more equitable workplace at Levi Strauss & Co. with Chip Bergh, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Elizabeth A. Morrison, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Welcome, Chip and Elizabeth.
Thank you for having us, Shartia.
Oh, great to have you. We have a lot to get into, so let's just dive right in. Chip, we recently commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. His killing, along with the killings of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, in the midst of a global deadly pandemic, was almost too much to bear and sparked global protests and rallying cries for equality and justice, as well as a reckoning on race. How have you been impacted both personally and as a leader?
Well, as you said, it was really a moment of racial reckoning in this country. I also had my own personal reckoning, I guess, as a leader, because one of the things that we did was we took a very quick look internally at where we stood from a racial diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. And the bottom line was we weren't where we needed to be. And I needed to kind of build my humility muscle and my empathy muscle. I publicly declared that I failed as a leader in this particular area. I have a lot to be proud of over 10 years, turning the company around, taking the company public. But I failed as a leader in not building an organization that was as diverse as it needed to be and a culture that was as inclusive as it needed to be. And I am personally committed to making a difference. You know, at the time of George Floyd's murder, I said something to the effect of, we all need to do something to end structural racism in this country. Failing to act makes us complicit. And I'm in a position as a leader to make a difference in my company and make a difference here. And I firmly believe that this is not just a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. We will be a better company when we are more diverse and more inclusive.
Well, that brings us to Elizabeth. That's one of the changes that you made in 2020 following the just historic year that we had last year. Elizabeth, you joined the company during the fourth quarter of 2020. What has surprised you most on your listening tour, and what was one of the first things you did in this role?
Thank you again for having both of us to talk about this. And one of the first things that I did, and that honestly the company did for me, was set me up for success by declaring that DE&I was going to be one of our top business priorities for the year. There was high visibility from the very beginning. The first week I was on our global town halls that Chip does, Chips and Beer, being introduced to all of the employees, and again, having us double down on our commitment and what the action is going to be behind that. What I've heard from employees, I think I was surprised at the level of passion and the hunger for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that, marginalized employees, that's something that they've articulated and wanted for so long, but across the board, from, leaders down to our retail distribution centers and plants, the desire and the appetite from employees, managers, it's incredible. So people really are hungry for that knowledge and the how. Strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion. How does it operate? How do we do it? How do we solve these challenges that we're facing?
Mm-hmm. And Chip, what were some of the reactions you received from your global leadership team as you had this personal reckoning and admission that more can be done?
Well, one of the things that we did pretty early on was we invited our Black employee resource group to come talk to us as a team. And this is where, the empathy building really came into play. Just hearing from them what they live day to day, both on the outside, living and working in the Bay Area, but also on the inside, hearing about the microaggressions that happen inside the company and the challenges that they have, hearing how difficult it is to look up the hierarchy and not see somebody like you in a position of higher authority and power. And it was, listening to some of their stories, honestly, was very, very gut-wrenching. I mean, that is not the kind of company that I want to be a part of. And I'm in a place where I can make that kind of change and drive that kind of change to create a more inclusive. At the end of the day, this is about company culture, but it's also about business performance. And we're just not living up to the full potential of the company when we've got that kind of a culture inside and when we're not as diverse and representative of the consumers that we're serving in this country and around the world. And so it really was very, very important for all of us on the leadership team to hear the experiences of the individuals inside the company and what they deal with day to day. And that's what led us to making diversity, equity, and inclusion a top strategic priority. Every year I talk about our top priorities with the entire organization, and this is one of them. And it's not going to be a one and done type of thing. It's not like at the end of this year we're going to say we're done and we can move on. I think this is going to be a long-term commitment to to really addressing the culture of the company.
I definitely want to talk about senior leadership representation and boosting those numbers. But Elizabeth, Chip was talking about talking to our colleagues. One debate I had with a friend, how or should Black employees and other underrepresented groups discuss our experience and trauma to senior leadership?
Yeah, and quite honestly, there's a fine line. So we absolutely want to create a safe space for employees to express themselves. And it's important that people understand that culture isn't experienced the same by everyone. But also we have to walk a line, because when people share their stories, they can be triggered and it can be them reliving pain over and over again. So how much and how vulnerable we ask people to be in a public space around highly personal and sometimes hurtful experiences, we really do have to balance that. One of the things that we've done is we are having racial healing sessions with professional mental health experts, and we have both sessions that are closed to marginalized employees. Right now, we have them with our Black employees and also with our Asian employees because of the anti-Asian sentiment that's been happening. And then we have sessions with those same practitioners for all employees. And so there's more of a controlled environment. There's a safe space for people who are experiencing similar trauma to kind of bond and share pain, but also go on a journey of healing. And then there's an open session. And that is really helping employees that really feel as though they need that safe space, and also us to get a better understanding of what those experiences are like, and then shape our programs, plans, strategies around that so that we're meeting the moment.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of meeting the moment, our Gen Z and our younger millennials, they want change yesterday. So, Chip, how are you and Elizabeth and the entire global leadership team balancing long-term strategic planning with quick fixes, easy victories to show everyone that you're engaged and you're working, getting the work done?
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of the short-term goals that we've had and what we've put into place, and Elizabeth can talk a little bit about the longer-term strategic plan and the maturation process, I guess, of really driving this over time, because we are committed to this to the long term, and some of this change probably will take a little bit of time. And in fact, I would say I'm incredibly impatient because I really have embraced this as this has got to be part of my legacy of the company, not just turning it around and taking it public, but really building a diverse organization that is living up to its full potential from a culture standpoint. So we made a number of commitments after George Floyd's murder. And one of the very first things we did was we were transparent with our data. And we broke it down, by ethnic diversity, racial diversity, if you will, at all levels across the United States. And we also broke it down by retail and distribution centers. And the hard, ugly truth of the numbers was when we looked at our corporate headquarters, we are far below representation, particularly with Black leaders inside the company. And that was, the humble pie moment for me, because we went public with that. And we committed to make real progress. We committed that we were going to be transparent on an annual basis, and we updated it back early this year, early in the calendar year. When we updated the demographic data, we also provided transparency on pay equity data, which we committed that we would start doing as well. And the good news there is that there was no pay equity discrepancy by race. We made commitments around hiring some key leaders. Elizabeth is one of them. We were very quick to follow through there. And I have to say, I am blessed with having a great leader here. And she is a terrific partner. This is not her job. It's my job. And she helps me really drive it in so many ways. It's got to be driven from the top from me. But she's an incredible resource for us and has really landed great. We've added a new member to our board of directors, Elliot Rogers, who's the chief information officer at Ulta. He's got a lot of retail experience. He earns a seat at our board because of his experience. It's great that he happens to be also a Black leader. And I really make that point emphatically because he is a terrific board member and very, very experienced and really rounds out our board. And then, we've put into place, we've declared this a strategic priority, but we review our progress with the board of directors. And we've actually included a component of executive compensation tied directly to the progress that we make on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore have periodic reviews with the board of directors on our progress. And in fact, Elizabeth is presenting at our upcoming board meeting later this month. So, she'll give her first strategy review to the board on what we're doing for both the short term and the long term. And Elizabeth, maybe you want to talk about the maturation process.
Sure, absolutely. Really back in March, I rolled out our first ever global strategy. So really, what is the focus, what do we mean by diversity and valuing talent and equity and, creating fairness and inclusion with brand and culture and influence? What do those initiatives look like, both on a short-term level, but we've got to get to work, and we are already at work, I should say, building our infrastructure. So that did not exist before. As Chip said, there was we have a lack in representation, but also in the partnerships, the talent partnerships we need, the scorecard we need to hold ourselves accountable, the actual initiatives around talent development and talent management, looking at our processes and our systems to ensure equity. That's the real work that we've hit the ground running doing. This year and next year, we'll be very focused on that. And representation is really a lagging indicator. So when Chip talks about, the maturation process and/or model, for us, I embedded a diversity maturity model in our strategy so that I could talk to both leaders and to employees about the phases that we'll go through as we build this infrastructure and start to execute and really reap the rewards, hopefully, of our efforts.
Now, are you setting...
I was going to say, the only thing I would add is that I think it's important that we be impatiently patient, if that makes sense. Recognize that we are making progress, but being dissatisfied that we aren't where we need to be even at this point, and that there's, and having that hunger and that sense of urgency to addressing this quickly is really, really important. And I think employees need to see that and they need to feel that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you've set metrics when it comes to you're having a diverse slate, right? 50% of applicants for a role should be a person of color. Are you setting targets for your numbers and representation throughout your leadership and company ranks as well? Or do you have targets in place by end of the year?
The short answer is yes. And again, we're not where we need to be right now. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're very, very committed to it. And one thing I'll say about this company is when we commit to getting something done, we will get it done. But this is not going to happen overnight. We like to promote people internally as much as we can. We've got to build more of a pipeline. One of the other great hires that we made is we've hired somebody who's going to lead all of our recruiting out of colleges and universities, and with a real focus on historically Black colleges and universities. We have an intern program. This year, our interns are about 80% diverse, which is terrific. And so it's going to take time, but we need to be impatiently patient with this.
Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth, yeah. I know you're, go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to add on to that and say, one of the talking points that we have with our employees in the conversations is about several things being true at the same time. So while we have our strategy in place, our strategy is the first step. So we've got to execute on that plan and hold ourselves accountable. We've got to continue to invest in both the team, as Chip just mentioned, and in the work. And so being real about the challenges we face and the lack of infrastructure, but the absolute commitment and showing that and demonstrating that through our actions is really kind of a key part of our journey.
Are either of you concerned about possible backlash, if you will, from staff members who may feel they're focusing on this group, that group? What about me? How do you confront that?
Sure, I would love to take that one. And absolutely, we have heard from employees that are concerned about the focus right now on Black and Latinx employees. There's obviously other marginalized employees that are part of our organization. And, our real focus is to go where we're most underrepresented, and that's where we are most underrepresented right now. There's also a focus on senior level women because we're unfortunately losing women as we kind of climb the ranks in the organization. But the talent practices, the strategic focus, the solutions that we are coming up with and the actions that we are taking to increase our representation with our most underrepresented employees, those are going to make us better. Those are going to make our talent practices better and more inclusive. That is going to ensure that when we go to market, we're going to market and looking for the best talent, that we are looking internally and promoting the best talent. So over time, our efforts shouldn't be segregated or separated into this is what we're doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is what we should be doing for our talent. This is what we should be doing for our business. And it should be holistic. I mean, in a way, I'm trying to work myself out of a job because this should be the way that we work. But of course, I hope to be with the company for a long time. Chip.
Just to build on that, I mean, this does get back to the central point, which is this is a business imperative. We're not the kind of company we have the full potential to be because we don't have the kind of diversity that we need at all levels of leadership. And as Elizabeth said, yes, it does make some people uncomfortable. I need to be the strongest ally for the Black community inside this company, for the Asian community inside this company, for the Latinx community, for the LGBTQ community. And that is an important growth opportunity for me as well. And I think getting people to understand that we're not doing this just because it's the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do. We're doing this because it's going to make us a better company fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Chip, how much of your day are you allocating to these efforts? I know you have Elizabeth and her growing team, and they're putting in the work, but how much of your time is this now baked into every decision you're making as the CEO?
Yeah, it's hard to put a number on it because, like everything else, it kind of ebbs and flows. But I would say that, most of the key decisions that I'm making, and particularly as we start thinking about talent and staffing and driving a talent agenda that really does have a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's becoming more a part of my time than it ever was in the past. It needs to be more a part of my time, just given its strategic priority and focus. So it definitely is getting a lot more attention. I also would say that, we have a relatively new chief HR officer, Tracy Laney, who joined the company literally, I think it was the first week of the lockdown when she first joined. I think she and I went maybe 9 months before we met each other face to face in person after she joined. But it's also a big part of her remit as well. And she spends a lot of her time with Elizabeth as well. And as we map out our talent program on a go-forward basis, that's where we're putting a lot of our energy.
Definitely. Elizabeth, you worked previously in the media and entertainment industry. How does that experience inform how you're going about building trust and communicating with your colleagues at Levi?
Yeah. So I think my background being in strategic communications, culture, and engagement is part of it. But, the quality of the strategy matters, but also how we package it and the transparency and the way that we are presenting it. So bringing the energy, bringing the commitment, bringing the real passion to life, I think in a way that excites our employees and allows and supports our leaders to lean in, from ally to activist, as I like to say. I need them to take active roles in driving DE&I. It's not going to be just myself and Chip and my small team and Tracy. It's going to be our fuller HR organization. It's honestly going to be every employee at our company, from our plants and retail to our corporate office, really leaning in and figuring out how they can make a difference and help us to deliver diversity, equity, and inclusion at LS & Co.
Final question, and I'll start with you, Elizabeth. We have an esteemed global audience tuning in today. What advice would you give to these C-suite executives tuning in on their journey to create an equitable workplace? What is one thing they should do?
They've got to lean in. They've got to find out where the energy is and how they can make a difference. We need them desperately.
Chip?
Well, I think every leader needs to take a real hard look in the mirror, take a look at the numbers for their company or their organization. And, if you want to make a change, the best place to start is to declare where you are and then go from there. And, in our case, it meant declaring we had a problem and that we had a real issue, but that also creates a huge opportunity.
Oh my goodness, I could talk to you all for the next hour. Just thank you both so much. Chip Bergh and Elizabeth A. Morrison, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining Corporate Mandate for Change, a Bloomberg Equality briefing. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. Thanks again to all of our speakers for such a wonderful program. And thank you to our sponsor, Cisco, for making this virtual briefing possible. And most of all, thank you for being such an engaged audience. Thank you for watching.